Welcome to Retro Reads, where timeless mysteries come to life. Today, a new case awaits, full of twists, secrets, and thrilling revelations. Settle in, relax, and let the adventure begin. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from and at what time. Let's get started and dive into this unforgettable story. It was just shy of 9:15 when I tiptoed into the orchid room, carrying Wolfe's schedule in one hand and a fresh pot of the Sumatran roast in the other. The heat was already climbing, the scent of Phalaenopsis heavy in the air, and Wolfe was perched like a brooding Buddha over a bench of delicate Miltonias, misting each leaf with the reverence of a priest blessing relics. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. I have a way of entering a room that doesn't require introductions. Archie, he said, which was his usual way of admitting I existed. If that is your cologne, I urge you to return it, preferably with a formal apology to the manufacturer. I poured the coffee with one hand and placed the day's agenda on the side table with the other. It's either that or the pot roast Fritz is abusing downstairs. Your pick. That earned me a flicker of an eyebrow. He was not in the mood for levity. I could tell by the rhythm of his misting, sharper, more punctuated, like someone trying not to be interrupted, which naturally was an invitation. Before I could supply further nuisance, we heard it. The unmistakable clang of a copper pot meeting a tiled floor with enough force to shake the African violets. Wolfe stiffened. Fritz didn't drop cookware. He was a culinary ninja, silent, precise, and emotionally neutered. This was not in character. Wolfe straightened and sighed. If that man is experimenting again with Szechuan influence, he muttered, I shall have no recourse but to fire him, mourn him, and dine out. I held my tongue. Barely. A rattle in Fritz's domain was usually a sign of weather change. This was a storm. Back in the front room, the phone rang like it had something urgent to confess. I caught it on the third ring. Goodwin, residence of Nero Wolfe. He's currently communing with a potted orchid, but I'm available for less vegetative consultations. A woman's voice, smooth, clipped, and laced with barely restrained panic, came through. I need help, not the kind you advertise in the phone book if you do that sort of thing, but the kind that won't end up in a headline. My brother's work has been stolen, and now he's lying in a hospital bed with no memory of how he got there. Name? I asked, reaching for my notepad. Clarissa Mayfield. My brother is Rudy Mayfield, the pastry chef. That got my attention. Even my sweet tooth had heard of Rudy Mayfield. He was a rising culinary deity, the Mozart of mousse. If you could turn butter and flour into music, Rudy was playing Carnegie Hall. I softened my tone just a hair. What exactly was stolen? A recipe, his newest creation. It was supposed to debut at the Manhattan Grand Culinary Showcase this weekend. Now someone else is presenting something suspiciously similar, and Rudy's too shaken to fight it. I heard her breathe. One of those thin, shaky breaths people take when they're trying not to cry or confess. Where are you now, Miss Mayfield? I'm at my apartment, Upper East Side. Can you come? I looked toward the office, where Wolfe would shortly emerge from his orchid trance to demand lunch, silence, and solitude. Possibly. But first I'll need a few more details. You mentioned sabotage. You sure it wasn't a creative difference over whipped cream? It wasn't creative, it was cruel. Her voice was firm now, and whoever did this wanted to destroy him. A beat of silence passed between us. That was when I knew this one wouldn't be about stolen ingredients. It would be about pride, betrayal, and something no amount of frosting could cover up. When I walked into the kitchen to relay the news, I didn't have to explain much. Fritz was standing at the stove, his shoulders stiff, arms rigid at his sides, and a copper pot on the floor, exactly where it had landed. The scent of something cinnamon-rich hung in the air, but whatever magic he'd been working on had clearly turned to ash. He didn't look up. "She called?" I arched a brow. "So you were expecting it?" "I told Rudy to speak to Mr. Wolfe himself," Fritz said, low and precise, each word like a knife being honed. "But Rudy is proud and wounded." Fritz rarely editorialized. He served food, not emotion. But today, his voice had an edge that could slice through soufflé. "Tell me," I said, settling onto the corner stool. "Is this about a cake or a crime?" He shook his head. "It is about creation, about theft of the soul. Rudy created something extraordinary. And now it is being displayed under another's name while he lies in bed, broken." I'd seen Fritz in a fury over burnt bechamel, but this was different, personal. "You know Wolfe doesn't take pastry theft cases," I said, carefully. Fritz looked at me then, eyes sharp and bright. "He will take this one. He must." And in that moment I knew Wolfe didn't have a choice. Not when Fritz spoke like that. Rudy Mayfield wasn't just another chef. He was something closer to legacy. Wolfe didn't emerge from the orchid room until 11:03. He moved slowly, deliberately, like a man postponing an unpleasant chore. He settled in his chair, glanced at the unopened mail, and grunted, "You have a face." "I often do," I replied. "This one happens to be delivering a culinary distress signal." I summarized Clarissa's call. When I mentioned Rudy Mayfield's name, Wolfe's nostrils twitched. By the time I reached the part about Fritz's emotional involvement, he set down his glass and gave me a long, slow stare. "Fritz," he said, "has never asked a favor of me that wasn't garnished with civility. If he is distressed, there is cause." He closed his eyes, the way he does when negotiating terms with his conscience. After a moment, "You may invite the woman here at 2:00, which, in Wolfe speak, was a signed contract. And just like that, a stolen cake, a hospitalized chef, and one emotional gourmand had managed to stir the unshakable Nero Wolfe. God help the thief. The Mayfield apartment was nestled neatly on the Upper East Side, the sort of place where the wallpaper costs more than my annual shoe budget, and the armchairs are designed less for comfort than conversation. Clarissa answered the door with the poised urgency of someone used to keeping appearances intact while things quietly unraveled beneath them. She was dressed in a tailored dove-grey suit, her hands folded precisely at her waist, like she didn't trust them to stay still on their own. She didn't offer coffee, which was just as well, because I hadn't come for small talk. I'd come to see how much truth she was willing to part with. "My brother is resting," she began, leading me into a room that looked curated by someone with an allergy to clutter and sentiment. "He's been heavily sedated since the incident." "What incident?" I asked, sliding into a chair that tried to correct my posture by force. She hesitated. "The day before the contest, he collapsed in the kitchen. We assumed it was exhaustion, but later, after his recipe appeared in someone else's hands." "Henri Valor?" I interjected. Her jaw tensed. "Yes, Henri. He unveiled a cake that was, it was Rudy's, almost exactly. The structure, the flavor profile, everything except the name." I leaned forward slightly. "You mentioned sabotage on the phone. Was Rudy attacked?" She shook her head, but not with conviction. "There was no physical harm, but emotionally, he's undone. He won't speak to anyone, won't eat, barely sleeps. It's as though something fundamental was taken from him." "And you believe Henri stole the recipe?" "I don't know," she said, voice tightening. "But someone did, and they did it to ruin him." She didn't cry. That wasn't her style. But her silence after that was louder than most sobs, and it had the same effect. He was propped up in bed like a man halfway to convalescence but unwilling to arrive. The private clinic room was modest, the view forgettable, and the patient somewhere between withdrawn and frozen. Rudy Mayfield didn't look like the revolutionary genius of the patisserie world. He looked like a man who'd overreached and fallen, except there wasn't a scratch on him. Clarissa stayed in the hall, which I appreciated. Some conversations do better without siblings hovering like hall monitors. I pulled up a chair, gave him the patented Goodwin grin, and said, "Don't mind me, I'm just here for the cake." His lips twitched, but barely. "Then you're late," he murmured. That was the most he gave me for a while. I asked about the contest, the recipe. Henri, the hospital stay. Each prompt landed like a pebble in a well, ripples but no returns. Finally, I went for the angle that usually works on the proud ones. "Fritz is worried. That's rare enough to set off alarms." That earned me something, a flicker of guilt maybe, or embarrassment. "Tell him I'm grateful," he said softly. "You could tell him yourself," I offered. "I will. When I'm ready." I gave him a long look. "Look, I'm not a priest, a therapist, or your publicist. I work for Wolfe. He doesn't chase clients. If you want him involved, you need to help him help you. Otherwise, this is just an expensive house call." He glanced at me then, for the first time, really looked. "You wouldn't understand," he said, voice low. "Try me." He turned his face toward the window. "They didn't just steal my recipe, they stole my hands." I left without pressing further. He wasn't lying, he just wasn't ready to tell the truth. If you want to understand the culinary world, forget everything you know about food. It's not about flavor, it's about fame, about who can turn sugar into spectacle and pastry into power. That's what I kept in mind as I stepped into the grand Culinary Showcase's pre-event tasting hall. It smelled like ambition glazed with vanilla. Henri Valor was the first to spot me, tall, impossibly well coiffed, and wrapped in a white chef's jacket that gleamed like armor. His accent was as French as his ego. "You are an admirer of the art?" he asked, eyes scanning me the way you'd inspect a suspicious soufflé. "Let's say I represent someone with a vested interest in recipes remaining in the right hands." He smiled, slow and oily. "Ah, you mean Monsieur Mayfield, the delicate genius." I kept my face neutral. "You've debuted a new cake recently," he beamed. "Yes, a reinvention, subtle, bold, a fusion of tradition and audacity, and curiously similar to Rudy's entry." His expression didn't change. Inspiration is like yeast. It floats, it lands, it grows. I was about to reply when a voice cut in, sharp, clear, and British. "Yeast floats, theft sticks, Louisa Croft, dark-haired, efficient, and dressed in the kind of simplicity that screamed confidence." She regarded Henri like he was an overbaked croissant. "I knew Rudy when he still needed guidance separating egg whites," she said. "He's brilliant. But brilliance without discipline is a mess on the floor." "Is that why you two parted ways?" She shrugged. "Creative differences, and a refusal on his part to acknowledge where half his ideas came from." "Interesting," I said. "Did any of those ideas include a recipe for sabotage?" She smiled without warmth. "If I wanted to destroy Rudy, I wouldn't bother with recipes. I'd just let him talk to the press." Before I could respond, we were interrupted by a third voice. "Is this the interrogation corner, or am I late for the ego parade?" Max Qualls. Once a restaurant critic, now turned chef, by what he called palate fatigue. His presence reeked of disillusionment and rosemary. "Don't ask him for an opinion," Henri warned. "He only writes adjectives." Max grinned. "Better than baking apologies." 3 suspects, 3 motives, 1 stolen recipe, and more than enough knives in the room, none of them culinary. I smiled politely, made my excuses, and left. Wolfe wouldn't like any of them, which meant we were getting closer. The front of Maison Mayfield, Rudy's bakery, was all polished marble and curated minimalism, the kind of design that made you feel underdressed even if you weren't. The pastries were behind glass like jewels, and the staff wore expressions that implied anything less than reverence was a personal offense. The young woman behind the counter, sleek and polished, didn't so much greet me as filter me. But when I mentioned I was following up on the contest incident, her posture flickered, and she motioned me discreetly toward the back. In the rear kitchen, the atmosphere shifted from boutique elegance to practical chaos. I was met by Nico, the assistant pastry chef, narrow shoulders, restless hands, and the wary energy of someone who'd seen more than he was paid to handle. "We're not supposed to talk to outsiders," he said as I leaned casually against the prep table. "I'm not an outsider," I replied. "I'm worse. I'm an investigator." He blanched a little, then leaned in. "There was a box, swapped before the delivery to the showcase. I didn't see who did it. I just know the tape was different, and someone had written over the label." "What kind of box?" "White, square. Standard cake transport box, but Rudy always initials his. This one didn't have his mark." "And you told him?" He nodded. He went silent, just didn't say anything for a long time. I filed that under suspicious reactions from gifted chefs. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of a leather-bound kitchen journal on the corner of Rudy's desk. I flipped through it, not expecting much, until a page near the back showed heavy scorch marks. The heat had warped the ink, but not enough to hide the fact that something had been torn out. What remained was a partial formula, cinnamon, vanilla extract, and illegible. I wasn't in the habit of baking, but I knew this much. That wasn't a smudge, it was a deliberate burn, and it left a bitter aftertaste. Clarissa wasn't expecting me when I returned to the apartment, which made it all the more worthwhile. She opened the door with a startled blink and tried to recover by smoothing her hair. "I thought we'd discussed everything," she said. "I'm not here for discussion," I said. "I'm here for your garbage." Her brows lifted. "I beg your pardon?" "Garbage, refuse, discards, the place where secrets go to decompose." To her credit, she didn't slam the door. Instead, she stepped aside and gestured vaguely toward the kitchen. "I assume you'll want gloves." I grinned. "I'll survive." The trash was bagged neatly, as expected. Clarissa struck me as someone who alphabetized her hangers, but wedged between a wad of kitchen towels and a used envelope was a half-folded piece of stationery. Thick, expensive, the kind that never hosts anything pleasant. The handwriting was jagged. "You think you can bury the past with icing and flair? He will pay. So will you." I turned the paper over. No signature. Just a smudge of something, possibly cocoa, possibly ink. I tucked it into my coat. "Did Rudy see this?" I asked, holding it up. Her face turned pale. I meant to throw it away. I thought it was a prank." "Do you get a lot of threatening pastry notes?" She looked away. "I thought it was from Louisa, or one of the critics. People can be cruel." But this wasn't tossed in a hurry. It was folded, kept, then discarded. I gave her a long look. "You were hiding it." Clarissa exhaled slowly. "I was protecting him." I didn't argue, not because I believed her, but because she wanted me to. And that meant she was scared of someone or something. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was settled into his chair, feet on the hassock, fingertips arched like an academic monument. I gave him the highlights, burnt pages, box swap, and the trash note. He absorbed each point without commentary until I finished with, "We'll need eyes." discreet ones. Without looking up, he said, "Saul." It wasn't a question. It never was. I made the call. When Saul Panzer answers, he doesn't ask what, when, or why. He just says where, and then he's gone like a shadow in a well-lit room. Later that evening, the brownstone kitchen was uncommonly still. Fritz had brought back a sample of Rudy's latest cake, what he called a final prototype, before the sabotage. Wolfe did not eat it, naturally. But Fritz tasted it, carefully, reverently. Then he closed his eyes, paused, and frowned, an expression as rare on his face as a grease stain. "There is an intrusion," he said softly. "Intrusion?" "Yes. The structure is his, the layering technique unmistakably his. But the sweetness is artificial, slightly metallic, and the vanilla flat." "Could it be psychological?" I asked. "No." His tone brooked no doubt. "This cake was tampered with, and not merely by accident." Wolfe opened his eyes and finally spoke. "Then we are not merely pursuing theft," he said. "We are pursuing betrayal." And just like that, the sugar turned to steel. It wasn't the first time culinary drama had stolen the spotlight, but this time it came with paramedics. The incident occurred at the Grand Culinary Showcase, where Henri Valor had been scheduled to perform a live baking demonstration. That phrase had always amused me. Chefs don't perform, they perspire. But this one was being filmed for syndication, and Henri had turned it into a full act. Flashing knives, gleaming bowls, a breathless sous chef trotting behind him like a page at court. I wasn't there when it happened. I was getting my shoes shined at a booth down the hall, but I heard the gasps, the muffled shriek, and the unmistakable clatter of stainless steel against tile. When I arrived, Henri was already on the floor, eyes wide, mouth slack, crumpled next to a pristine slice of cake like a tragic advertisement for poor timing. Paramedics swarmed, cameras were hastily turned away. A few attendees hovered with the predatory alertness of people who smelled scandal. And over it all hung the unmistakable scent of burnt cinnamon and lemon glaze. The MC, one of those eternally tanned types with perfect teeth, tried to usher people out, but not before I caught a glimpse of the cake itself. It was layered, immaculate, frosted with that smug perfection that chefs like Henri prided themselves on. But there was something else. Something familiar in the structure. I didn't need Fritz to tell me it looked like Rudy's creation. Henri was taken away, still unconscious. He never made it to the emergency room. By the time the footage had been confiscated and the judges hushed up, word had gotten around. Henri Valor was dead. The cake that killed him had been his own. Or so it seemed. But the recipe, like the motive, had someone else's fingerprints all over it. It didn't take long for the medical examiner's report to confirm what we suspected but didn't want to say out loud. Henri Valor had been poisoned. The culprit wasn't arsenic or strychnine, nothing so dramatic. Instead, it was coumarin, a naturally occurring compound found in certain cinnamon substitutes, banned in food products for exactly this reason. "Subtle," Wolfe said after reviewing the report from the comfort of his chair, glass in hand, cravat intact. "And efficient. If one must kill with dessert, that is the preferred route." I didn't disagree. The poison had been baked into the cake's glaze, fused to the surface like an edible epitaph. "The dosage?" I asked. "Measured to avoid suspicion," Wolfe murmured. "A lesser constitution might have merely fainted. Valor, it seems, was not made for resilience. Whoever did it knew their chemistry. And their baking. That was the crux of it. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment sprinkle. This was precision, intentional, elegant, and fatal. It also changed the stakes. We weren't just dealing with recipe theft or culinary sabotage. We were now firmly entrenched in murder, and that meant things were going to get crowded. The police would circle, reporters would sniff, lawyers would whisper behind oak-panelled doors. Wolfe, of course, didn't budge. He didn't need to. The mountain never moves. It waits for climbers. But I knew what he was thinking. Coumarin wasn't an accident, and if Henri had baked Rudy's stolen cake, then someone had taken more than a recipe. They'd taken revenge. Only question was, for what? The sample arrived at the brownstone the next morning in a triple-sealed box with enough legal warnings attached to make even a customs inspector sweat. Fritz handled it like it was a religious relic. I kept a cautious distance. My threshold for poisoned pastries had been permanently lowered. Wolfe didn't taste it, of course. He observed. Fritz did the rest with his usual monastic focus. He sliced the cake, examined the texture, inhaled, and finally took the most delicate of bites. "Very good," he murmured. Then he frowned. "That's not praise," I noted. "Number it's mimicry." He turned to Wolfe. "The base technique is Rudy's, without doubt. The layering is his method. He uses a reverse emulsion batter, very distinctive, but..." "But?" Wolfe prompted. "The cinnamon is inferior, bitter, a flat finish, and the vanilla is artificial. Rudy would never allow that." "Could Henri have made those changes?" I asked. "Perhaps. But the effect is subtle. You wouldn't notice unless you were trained." Which Henri was. So the question becomes, why alter it at all? Wolfe's fingers steepled. To disguise the origin, to claim authorship through imperfection. I added, or to deliver the poison without altering the recognizable structure. Wolfe nodded. "That, Mr. Goodwin, is the more likely conclusion." It was clear now. The cake Henri presented was Rudy's in spirit, but tampered with in body. Which left us with two possibilities. Henri had stolen the recipe and added the poison himself, or someone had fed him the poison already baked in. Either way, we weren't just sniffing around a case of culinary jealousy anymore. We were dancing on the icing of a premeditated murder. There are few things in life that give me more satisfaction than watching Nero Wolfe frown. Not the exasperated kind he reserves for me, but the pensive, teeth-in-the-puzzle kind. It usually means we're getting close. And that day, when Saul dropped off the file from Rudy's kitchen lab, the man frowned like it was a national emergency. Rudy's recipe notebook had been confiscated for clarification by the event's organizers, but Saul had managed to get it into Wolfe's hands for a quiet perusal. There, nestled between 2 pages thick with frosting ratios and citrus emulsions, was a loose slip, handwritten, oil-stained, and freshly smudged. It was a modified version of the same cake Henri had presented before his very public and irreversible demise. "This page," Wolfe murmured, "was not in Rudy's original collection." "How do you know?" I asked, flipping through the earlier entries. "Because he signs each draft with a flourish. This one is unsigned, and the notations are clumsy." Fritz, peering over Wolfe's shoulder, added, "The method here is flawed. Rudy wouldn't blind bake at this temperature." I took the page and gave it a closer look. Near the bottom corner, just above a faint butter smear, was a fingerprint. Not Rudy's. We'd already taken samples, not Clarissa's either. "Think we can match it?" I asked Wolfe. "No need," he replied. "We simply need to ask who touched Rudy's notes without consent, and why." A call to our friendly neighborhood lab assistant confirmed it. The print belonged to someone already in the event database, Louisa Croft. It was a neat little nudge toward suspicion, but Wolfe didn't pounce. He never did. He merely let it hover like smoke that would eventually point to fire. And sure enough, the next time I saw Louisa, her fingers were gloved, indoors. Summer in a bakery. Draw your own conclusions. Louisa Croft wasn't the type to invite sympathy. She was sharp where others softened, brisk where others stalled, and spoke like someone who never wasted flour or words. I met her again outside her newly opened boutique pastry shop on Bleecker, where the frosting was minimal and the drama evidently wasn't. "I won't pretend to be surprised," she said after I asked, about her connection to Rudy's original recipe. "But I am disappointed." "In him or yourself?" She gave a brittle smile. "In both. I gave Rudy the foundation. He layered on top. But he never acknowledged it, never credited me. Then, when he had his spotlight moment coming, he froze me out entirely." "Why not go public?" "And sound like a jealous ex-partner? No, thank you." "I preferred dignity, but not distance," I said. "Your fingerprint was found in his book." For a fraction of a second, she blinked. Then, as if she'd anticipated the strike, she said, "I saw the journal once when I visited the kitchen. He left it open. I glanced. If that was a crime, arrest every sous chef in Manhattan." She was slick. I'd give her that. But the tremor in her voice didn't come from sugar withdrawal. Meanwhile, Max Qualls had his own version of indignation to peddle. I found him leaning against a newspaper stand near Union Square, sunglasses perched on his forehead like a crown of irrelevance. "You want to know why I wrote that piece on Henri?" he said. "Because the man was a fraud with flair, no soul, no story." "You accused him of plagiarism without evidence." He shrugged. "He deserved it. He was a culinary leech. If he stole from Rudy, it wouldn't shock me. They all steal. Everyone in this business does." "Did you?" I asked. Max grinned. "I never had enough talent to be worth stealing from." Which, as motives go, may have been the most honest. He hadn't baked Henri's death, but he wouldn't have mourned it either. Louisa wanted respect, Max wanted relevance, and Rudy, he just wanted to disappear. Wolfe, however, wanted answers, and when he wanted them, they usually came knocking, one suspect at a time. Clarissa Mayfield wasn't fond of surprises unless they came folded into puff pastry. So when I rang her buzzer unannounced, she answered with the thin smile of someone deciding whether politeness or evasion would get me out of her living room faster. "Archie," she said, "you have the persistent charm of a telemarketer." I tipped my hat. "It's a gift, may I?" She didn't move, but she didn't block the door either. I took that as permission. Inside, the apartment was the same, austere, tastefully restrained, and clearly decorated by someone who believed emotions were best left unframed. She offered me tea, which I declined on the grounds that my patience was already steeping. "I'm here," I said, "because there's something you forgot to mention." Her eyes narrowed just slightly. "I've told you everything I know." "That's the problem," I said. "You know more than you've said." I pulled out a copy of the building's exterior security log, courtesy of Saul Panzer's unparalleled ability to make night guards suddenly cooperative. "The night before the contest," I said, "someone was seen leaving Rudy's bakery a little after midnight. Not Rudy, not a delivery boy, someone else, dressed in dark clothing, slim, quick. The camera didn't get a face, but the timestamp is real." She didn't speak for a moment. Then she sat, carefully, as though her bones had turned delicate. "I saw them," she said, quietly. "Then why didn't you tell us?" "Because I thought it would go away. I thought Rudy would recover, that no one would get hurt. And then Henri died." "Who was it?" I asked. She pressed her hands together, white-knuckled. "I can't say." "Won't or can't?" "Won't," she said, looking straight at me. "Because if I do, it won't just ruin Rudy's career, it will destroy him." That was when I realized she wasn't protecting herself, she was protecting a lie. And like all well-baked deceptions, this one was beginning to crack. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe sat in his chair like a king who'd just heard the peasants whisper. The morning's mail lay untouched. Fritz was politely pretending not to hover near the kitchen doorway. I delivered Clarissa's confession in full, including her refusal to name the midnight visitor. Wolfe said nothing at first. Then he nodded to the red leather binder resting on the tray beside him. "Saul's report," he said. I opened it. Inside was a list: expenses, transfers, withdrawals. Line by line, it painted a picture that didn't match Rudy Mayfield's public image as a culinary wunderkind. For a man supposedly in demand and flush with bookings, his finances were an elegant disaster. There were loans, some large, some curiously staggered, rent payments made late, ingredient invoices marked pending, and a particularly large withdrawal made 2 days before the contest, labelled simply as consulting fee. Who was he consulting? I asked aloud. No one reputable, Wolfe said, nor anyone who would issue an invoice. I flipped through the next few pages. He was bleeding money. And desperate, Wolfe said. Desperation makes fools of men, or worse, accomplices. But he didn't kill Henri, I said. No, Wolfe agreed. But he may have served the cake. We sat in silence for a moment while that thought baked. Rudy may not have mixed the poison, I added, but if he delivered it, knowingly or not, he's halfway to culpable. Not culpable, Wolfe murmured, but cornered, which makes him useful. People in corners tend to tell the truth, often accidentally. It was the closest thing to optimism I'd heard from him in days. I left the office to call Saul with one instruction: find the consulting fee, track it, trace it, learn who took it and what they gave in return, because someone out there had sold a recipe, but someone else had bought a death, and we were finally getting close enough to smell the burn. When Nero Wolfe issues invitations, they arrive not with warmth or welcome, but with the gentle menace of a subpoena. He doesn't ask people to come, he expects them. And when they arrive, as they inevitably do, they rarely know whether they're guests or suspects. That morning, he dictated 6 letters in succession, each one polite, firm, and layered in enough ambiguity to keep the recipient guessing whether they were about to be honored or hanged. The wording was classic Wolfe. In light of the recent developments regarding the unfortunate passing of Henri Valor and questions surrounding the originality of the recipe in question, Mr. Nero Wolfe requests your presence at his residence this evening at 7:30 sharp for the purpose of clarification and resolution of outstanding matters. Your cooperation will be most appreciated. Even Saul, who'd heard Wolfe command confessions from murderers with fewer syllables, raised an eyebrow at the phrase clarification and resolution. I personally delivered 2 of the invitations, one to Louisa Croft, who took it with the kind of composure a chess player uses when losing a bishop, and one to Max Qualls, who read it aloud with theatrical flourish before folding it and sticking it in his breast pocket like a love note from the devil. The rest went out by messenger. By 6 that evening, Fritz had polished the office to surgical standards. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle, an architectural formation Wolfe used to establish psychological hierarchy without appearing hostile. He called it the arrangement, I called it the trap. By 7:27, all parties had arrived: Louisa, Max, Clarissa, Rudy, and a visibly sweating pastry distributor named Halloran, who had somehow found himself pulled into the wake. They greeted each other like diplomats at a peace summit, smiles tight, eyes sharper than steak knives. Wolfe entered the room at exactly 7:30 and lowered himself into his chair with the gravitas of a man assuming command of a courtroom. He did not speak immediately. He let silence do the introductions. That was always the first move. Make them wonder why they're here. The silence stretched long enough to be called strategic. I took my usual post behind Wolfe's chair, not because he needed protection, but because it allowed me to observe. And there was plenty to observe. Clarissa sat near the corner, spine straight, hands knotted in her lap. Her eyes, normally clear and direct, flicked repeatedly toward Louisa, but never settled. Louisa, for her part, avoided the glance entirely, choosing instead to study the edge of the carpet like it had secrets of its own. Rudy looked thinner than he had 3 days ago. His suit didn't fit right, and the collar of his shirt was half a size too loose. The kind of thing you don't notice unless you know the man used to dress like his image depended on it, which, professionally, it did. Max Qualls, never one to miss an opportunity to appear aloof, sat with one ankle resting on a knee and a look that implied boredom with all things not about him. Wolfe, of course, said nothing. He scanned the room with those heavy-lidded eyes, neither inviting nor condemning, just watching. When he finally spoke, the room reacted like a held breath finally released. "I have called you here," he began, "because deception, like vanilla extract, tends to leave a trace, even in small doses." That got Max to shift slightly. Wolfe continued, "A man is dead, a recipe has been altered, and reputations, I understand, are fragile commodities in your world. You are not here to clear your names. You are here because your names are already entangled. What remains is to distinguish degree of involvement." No one replied. Louisa's foot began tapping, barely audible. Clarissa bit her lower lip. Rudy's brow glistened. Wolfe turned his gaze to Rudy. "Mr. Mayfield, have you anything to disclose regarding the whereabouts of your recipe draft the night before Henri Valor's demonstration?" Rudy opened his mouth, then closed it. A bead of sweat rolled past his ear. "It went missing. I didn't know where it had gone." Clarissa stiffened. "Indeed," Wolfe said. "And did you inquire? Pursue the matter? Or did you simply decide it was too inconvenient to retrieve the most important creation of your career?" "I was ashamed," Rudy murmured. "I knew it was compromised, but I couldn't prove it. So I said nothing." I scanned the room. No one looked surprised, which was the most telling detail yet. Wolfe leaned back, closed his eyes briefly, and said, "Mr. Goodwin, would you be so kind as to recount what we discovered in the bakery notebook?" I obliged. As I did, I kept one eye on Louisa. She sat very still. Too still. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from innocence, but calculation. Wolfe let the silence settle again. Then gently, almost conversationally, he added, "You see, ladies and gentlemen, it is not the theft that most concerns me. It is the lie wrapped around it. A lie is harder to frost over. It curdles." He paused. "And I intend to scrape every layer. There's an art to interrogation that doesn't involve raised voices or rubber hoses." Wolfe had perfected it into something resembling chamber music, subtle, layered, and designed to draw discord from silence. After I'd recounted the relevant observations from Rudy's notebook, Wolfe didn't launch into cross-examination. That would have been too pedestrian. Instead, he tilted his head, narrowed his eyes slightly, and addressed no one in particular. "It strikes me as peculiar," he said, "that a man of Henri Valor's self-regard would risk presenting an untested recipe on so public a stage. Peculiar and implausible." He let the implication dangle like a garnish no one wanted to touch. I watched Rudy swallow hard. Louisa opened her mouth, likely to deflect, but Wolfe held up a hand. "Miss Croft, you worked closely with Mr. Mayfield until when, precisely?" "Last year," she replied tightly. "He decided to open his own place. We parted amicably." "Indeed," Wolfe said, "and yet your methods were sufficiently distinctive that Fritz, who is not given to hyperbole, identified your influence in the very cake that led to Mr. Valor's demise." Max Quarles shifted in his seat and said, "You're dancing around something, Wolfe." "Why not just say it?" Wolfe ignored him. He was watching Clarissa now. "Miss Mayfield," he said, "I presume your brother kept detailed production records of his creations. Given the demands of competition, replication, and quality control, such records are essential." Clarissa nodded. "Yes, Rudy documents everything, every variation, every change." "Ah!" Wolfe's gaze turned to Rudy. "Then surely you have them. May we review the entries for the week prior to the showcase?" Rudy's hands gripped the armrests. I'd have to check. Some pages may be missing. It's possible." "That would be inconvenient," Wolfe said gently, "but not unprecedented. Records tend to become erratic when shame or fear intervene." The room stilled. "What are you implying?" Clarissa asked sharply. "Nothing," Wolfe replied smoothly. "Yet." That was the game. Wolfe didn't accuse, he arranged. He shifted the furniture of conversation until the guilty found themselves standing where the floor had vanished. And the next tile to shift was clearly under Rudy's feet. If a man is going to sweat in winter, he ought to have a better excuse than room temperature and discomfort. Rudy Mayfield was sweating now, and the reason had nothing to do with central heating. I'd seen it coming. Wolfe had laid the groundwork with surgical elegance, planting questions like landmines and stepping back to let the blast echo. "I believe," Wolfe said in that mild, courteous tone he reserves for dismembering falsehoods, "that you have a copy of your production log for the contest entry, do you not?" Rudy hesitated. Yes, but it's not complete." "Oh?" Wolfe's eyebrows rose. "What is missing?" "The entry for the night before the showcase," Rudy said, voice thin. "I didn't record it." Max snorted. "That's convenient." Clarissa cast him a sharp look, but Rudy didn't flinch. "I wasn't in the right frame of mind," he continued. Things were falling apart. I knew something was wrong with the recipe. I thought someone had accessed my notes. I was trying to fix it. "You tried to repair a compromised recipe?" Wolfe said slowly. "And didn't log the adjustments?" Rudy nodded, visibly miserable. Wolfe steepled his fingers. "Mr. Goodwin, please remind our guests what was discovered in the so-called updated version of the recipe Henri presented." I obliged. "The substitution of Saigon cinnamon with a less potent variant, vanilla of inferior grade, glaze method altered, but the base structure was Rudy's, same folding technique, same layer ratio." Louisa, arms crossed, said, "That's because he stole from me in the first place. He's just repurposing my methods." Wolfe cut through the bickering with a look. "Mr. Mayfield, were you alone in the kitchen that night?" Rudy's mouth opened, then closed. His eyes flicked toward Clarissa, just a second too long. Wolfe didn't pursue the glance. He didn't need to. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Then I shall assume, unless evidence contradicts it, that your omission was not incompetence. It was fear, the fear of what an accurate log would reveal." Rudy didn't respond. He couldn't. Silence, in that moment, said everything, and the rest of us listened carefully to it. Wolfe didn't move when I opened the door to let Saul in. He didn't need to. When Saul Panzer walks into a room, it's less like an entrance and more like the air taking a breath of silence. He tipped his hat to the room and then to Wolfe, who gestured toward the red chair he keeps for allies and operatives. Saul sat. "I've traced Rudy's movements the night before the showcase," Saul said. "He wasn't at the bakery between 11:30 p.m. and 1 a.m., contrary to what he told the organizers. His car was parked outside Clarissa's apartment, and he wasn't seen entering the kitchen by anyone on the overnight staff." Clarissa shifted slightly in her seat. Rudy said nothing. Saul continued, consulting a small notepad. His keycard wasn't logged after 10:45 p.m., and the bakery's surveillance system was disabled at 11:10. That had to be done manually. Which he claims not to remember doing, Wolfe said. Saul nodded. Convenient lapse. But here's the rub. The bakery's back alley camera, different system, picked up someone entering around 12:50. Too grainy to identify, but they used a key. And they left carrying something, looked like a cake box. Rudy's forehead beaded again. I could almost hear the internal monologue, lie, confess, or improvise. Wolfe, of course, didn't pounce. Instead, he folded his hands. Mr. Mayfield, if your log is incomplete, your kitchen time unverifiable, and your surveillance disabled, you must forgive me for entertaining the notion that your recollection has been curated. Rudy didn't deny it. He couldn't. Clarissa, in a voice too calm, said, "He came to my place." That's true. He was upset, but he wasn't hiding. Wolfe turned toward her. Not hiding, perhaps, but certainly not baking. It landed. Even Louisa, who up to that point had been silently assembling disdain, allowed herself a small smile. "You people don't understand," Rudy muttered. "The contest, everything. It was already slipping. I didn't know how to fix it." "You didn't fix it," Wolfe said. "You concealed it, and in doing so gave someone else the opportunity to finish what you couldn't." The room was still, but the floor was tilting, and we all knew it. It was Fritz who broke the silence next. And when Fritz speaks in front of guests, especially during a case, it's never casual. He had been standing by the door, arms crossed, jaw set, like a moral compass that had just been nudged. He cleared his throat gently. "If I may," he said, "I would like to correct a misconception." Wolfe raised a brow. "You may." Fritz stepped forward, his gaze flicking briefly to Rudy, then settling somewhere just past the fireplace. The recipe in question, the one at the center of this, was not entirely Rudy's. Rudy's head snapped up. "Fritz." "No," Fritz said, not unkindly, but with finality. "You are a gifted baker, but you are not without influence. And the structure of that cake, the filo fold layering, the chilled mousse technique, the timing of the sugar infusion, those are not yours alone, they are Louisa's, or rather, they were." A gasp that wasn't quite a gasp moved through the room like a dropped napkin at a formal dinner. "I taught Rudy," Fritz continued, "but Louisa refined him. Her methods were meticulous, calculated, the kind of precision that can only come from someone who values control over applause." Louisa blinked slowly. "I knew it," she said softly. "You tasted it and knew." "I did," Fritz admitted, "and I kept silent, because I believed the theft, though petty, was not criminal. Now I am not so certain." Max, who had remained quiet longer than was natural for him, said, "So the famous Rudy Mayfield wasn't so original after all." "That's not fair," Clarissa snapped. He elevated the work." Wolfe's voice came in, low and final. "He obscured the origin, which in art is forgivable. In law, less so." Rudy leaned forward, face pale. "I never thought it would come to this." "It didn't," Wolfe replied. "You did. When you erased a name, you opened a door. Someone else walked through with poison in their pocket." For once, no one had a quip. Max Qualls had done an admirable job of looking unbothered all evening, but Wolfe knew how to lift the lid when a man was beginning to simmer. He turned to Max with the same calm he might use to discuss the virtues of coddled eggs. "Mr. Qualls," he said, "you published a review of Henri Valor's cake within hours of the showcase. You described the flavor, the texture, and even the presentation in remarkable detail." Max shrugged. "I was there." "You were outside the demo room," I said. You weren't admitted. It was a private taping. Max's face stiffened just enough to ruin the shrug. I saw photos, heard descriptions. Not possible, Wolfe said. The broadcast was embargoed, and the only samples were destroyed for safety. Wolfe let that hang in the air. I was speculating, Max said quickly. That's what critics do. We fill in blanks. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. That is what liars do. Then gently, he turned toward the assembled group. The poison was not in the batter. That would be too unstable. It was in the glaze, applied with a fine brush, a brush swapped at Rudy's bakery. That brush, as Mr. Panzer has confirmed, bore traces of coumarin and was found in a trash bin behind Henri's hotel, wrapped in bakery parchment. Clarissa gasped. Rudy closed his eyes. Max Qualls opened his mouth, then closed it, and Wolfe smiled, just barely. The air in the office thickened. Not with heat or noise, but with something denser, truth, pressing its way through. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the unraveling began. Louisa was the first to crack. You people are unbelievable. Henri stole Rudy's cake, Rudy stole from me, and now I'm what? The villain? Did you poison Henri? I asked. No, she snapped. But I don't mourn him either. Clarissa rose halfway from her chair. You ruined Rudy's life. No, Louisa retorted. He did, when he decided credit was more important than conscience. Rudy looked at her and for once said nothing. Max Qualls' eyes narrowed, said, You're all missing the point. If Henri hadn't stolen the recipe, he'd still be alive. Theft has consequences. So does slander, Wolfe interjected. You falsely reviewed a dish you hadn't tasted. I was trying to stop him from ascending on someone else's work, Max said. Someone had to say it. The room turned on itself, suspicions overlapping like lattice crust. For a moment it felt like the center wouldn't hold, and Wolfe let it, because that's when people tell the truth, not when pressed, but when desperate to deflect. And we were almost there. There's a moment in every case when the guests stop being guests and start feeling like suspects. In Wolfe's office, it usually comes with a shift in temperature that has nothing to do with Fritz's thermostat. That moment arrived shortly after everyone had returned to their seats, though by then they weren't sitting, they were perching, balanced between confidence and collapse. Wolfe hadn't spoken in several minutes. He sat motionless, eyes half-lidded, as if letting the collective discomfort steep. He didn't need theatrics, he had gravity. I was standing behind him, notebook in hand, watching the room like a maitre d' at a knife-throwing contest. Louisa was tight-lipped and stony-eyed. Rudy stared at his shoes as though they might give him an alibi. Clarissa alternated between pale fury and anxious restraint. Max Qualls, to his credit, seemed to understand he'd worn out his last ounce of smirking tolerance. Wolfe finally shifted his weight and spoke, not loudly, but with clarity that made the room lean forward in unison. You are here, he said, because the cake served by Henri Valor was more than a dessert. It was an artifact of deceit. It bore fingerprints, not literal alone, but moral, creative, and criminal. No one interrupted, not yet. What remains, Wolfe continued, is to determine whose fingerprints mattered most and why one of them was stained with poison. He let that hang in the air like steam off a simmering reduction. Mr. Goodwin, he said, not turning, you may proceed. I opened the folder Saul had handed me that morning and gave a small nod. The room didn't breathe. They never did when Wolfe was just about to slice into the truth. Wolfe's voice settled into that slow, measured rhythm that meant no one was getting out early and no one was getting out clean. Mr. Mayfield, he began, you were not the victim of a stolen recipe. You were the architect of a forgery. The recipe in question was not taken, it was borrowed, reshaped, and ultimately offered up to the world as your own. Rudy flinched. Clarissa started to speak, but Wolfe raised a hand, and silence returned like a waiter with the check. You took methods devised by Miss Croft during your collaboration and incorporated them into a new cake, a hybrid, impressive in its construction but compromised in its originality. You failed to acknowledge your debt. That is not a crime, but what followed is. He let the pause stretch like dough. When you learned that Henri Valor had somehow acquired a version of your cake, likely through someone seeking to profit or punish, you saw an opportunity. Rather than expose your own vulnerabilities, the altered notes, the missing entry in the log, you staged a theft. You sabotaged your own record to build a narrative of victimhood. Clarissa looked visibly ill. Rudy said, "I never—" "You did," Wolfe said, calm as ever. "You may not have known how the recipe leaked. You may not even have known who planned to poison Henri, but you created the conditions for both. You introduced ambiguity. You allowed others to carry your deception forward while you clung to silence." Rudy's hands trembled in his lap. "I never meant for this. I was drowning. I thought if I could control the story—" "You cannot," Wolfe said, "control the truth. You can only delay it. And every delay deepens the betrayal." The room remained still, except for the sound of Rudy's breathing, short, shallow, and unmistakably cornered. Wolfe turned his head slightly, eyes narrowing on Clarissa with the same precision he reserved for poor vintages and overbaked croissants. "Miss Mayfield," he said, "it is rare that I encounter a lie maintained not for self-preservation, but for familial devotion. Your brother's silence created a vacuum. You filled it." Clarissa swallowed but didn't speak. "You saw someone leave the bakery that night," Wolfe continued. "You knew the surveillance was missing. And when the narrative of theft emerged, you supported it. You even discarded a threatening note, believing it would protect him." She finally spoke, voice brittle but composed. "I didn't know about the poison." "No," Wolfe agreed. "But you knew about the lie. You chose to protect a version of Rudy that no longer existed, the prodigy, the innovator, the brother who built his fame on flour and fire. But he had already compromised his creation. You merely helped maintain the illusion." Clarissa sat straighter, eyes glistening but dry. "I thought I could keep him afloat." "You did," Wolfe replied, "but only long enough for him to drown someone else." There was no judgment in his tone, just the cool weight of fact. And with that, he turned away from both siblings and looked toward Louisa. He was not finished. Having dismantled Rudy and Clarissa with his usual surgical detachment, Wolfe now turned to Louisa Croft. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't lean forward, he simply looked at her the way a hawk might observe a rabbit pretending not to twitch. "Miss Croft," he said, "your indignation has been clear. You were wronged, intellectually, professionally, and quite possibly personally. Mr. Mayfield took your technique and obscured your contribution. Then, when the result of that theft was appropriated by Henri Valor, you found yourself erased twice." Louisa didn't answer. She sat very still, her chin slightly elevated. "It is my belief," Wolfe continued, "that you discovered Rudy's deception long before the showcase. You confronted him. He minimized it. You watched Henri bask in the spotlight with a version of your work, knowing Rudy's silence made him complicit. And then you made a decision. Still no reaction, but her knuckles were white. You used the false narrative of theft to conceal a far more deliberate act. You poisoned the cake Henri was to present, your cake, your method, corrupted in every way but one. It still bore your signature, and you ensured it would never be forgotten." Clarissa inhaled sharply. Rudy turned a shade paler. "You knew the structure," Wolfe said. "You had baked it before, and you knew Henri would follow the formula exactly. He would never resist copying down to the brushstroke. You didn't need to add the poison to the batter. That would have been wasteful. You laced the glaze brush and made sure it ended up in his hands." Max muttered. "She worked in Rudy's kitchen before." "She had access." Wolfe nodded. "Indeed, the night before the contest, she entered through the back alley. Miss Mayfield saw a shadow and said nothing, because she believed it was her brother. Finally, Louisa spoke. 'You're very good, Mr. Wolfe.' 'Thank you,' Wolfe said. 'I am.' 'I didn't mean to kill him,' she added. 'I meant to ruin him. The poison was to make him ill, disgraced, not dead.' Wolfe raised an eyebrow. Intent is often murky when mixed with malice. Louisa turned toward Rudy. 'You had no right to bury me, Rudy.' He looked away. Wolfe's voice was cool. 'And now you are both unearthed.' I don't always appreciate when Wolfe saves his theatrical moments for the end, but this one was worth the price of admission. He reached to his left, opened a drawer, and produced a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a single white glove, baker's cotton, with a red stitched seam. Not unusual, unless you happened to know where it had been. "This," Wolfe said evenly, "was found by Mr. Panzer in a trash bin behind Henri Valor's hotel, wrapped in parchment printed with Rudy's bakery insignia. The glove bore faint traces of coumarin. And a single set of fingerprints, yours, Miss Croft." Louisa didn't blink. "It was mine," she said. "I won't insult you by denying it." Clarissa made a sound, half disbelief, half pity. "I wore gloves to prevent leaving a trace," Louisa went on calmly. "But the moment I picked up that brush, I forgot myself. I was angry, furious, that he would profit again, that none of you would ever know." Wolfe regarded her with something approaching pity. "We know now?" She gave a faint, tired smile. "It's almost a relief." Wolfe turned to me. "Archie?" "Already dialed," I said, pulling the phone off its cradle. "The police are on their way." No one moved, no one ran, there was nowhere to run. Louisa sat back in her chair, not defeated, but emptied. She had spent everything in the act. There was nothing left to conceal. As I waited for the line to connect, Wolfe poured himself a beer. Justice, in his world, didn't come with handcuffs. It came chilled, measured, and served with a final word. You'd think a confession would come with theatrics, tears, trembling hands, maybe even a gasp. But Louisa Croft wasn't built for dramatics. When she finally broke, it was with the quiet resignation of a woman who had lost something far more personal than freedom. "I knew he'd never give me credit," she said. "Not when it mattered. Not when the cameras were watching. That cake, my cake, was going to win Henri a trophy, and Rudy would have buried the truth under fondant and flattery." Wolfe didn't move. He let her speak. "I worked for that recipe. Every fold, every temperature curve, every cursed minute spent refining technique, while Rudy charmed the room and Henri posed for photographers. They took what I made, and then they erased me." "You could have pursued the matter legally," Wolfe said. "Or commercially, or even creatively." She smiled without warmth. "I could have, but no judge cares about technique. No magazine prints corrections on recipes. This was never about money, it was about being seen." Clarissa said quietly, "You killed a man for pride." Louisa turned to her. "Number I killed him because I was tired of pretending someone else baked the legacy I built." She looked at Rudy. "You don't get to stand on someone's shoulders and pretend you flew." He didn't answer. He couldn't. I watched Wolfe closely. He was still, but his expression held the faintest flicker of disdain, not for Louisa's act, but for the sentiment that fueled it. Wolfe had always despised intellectual theft more than murder. One was an act of heat, the other of pretense. "You used Rudy's lie as a cloak," Wolfe said, "and poisoned a man to expose a fraud. Congratulations, you have achieved clarity and ruin." Louisa didn't argue. She sat back in her chair, no longer posturing. Just done. And in the stillness that followed, you could almost hear the glaze cracking on the cake that started it all. The police arrived promptly, summoned by me 10 minutes before the final crescendo. Wolfe preferred they enter after the truth had already congealed. He didn't like sharing the kitchen. Louisa went quietly. No protest, no plea. Just a glance at Rudy that carried more weight than any parting speech. I doubt he'll forget it. As the officers led her away, Rudy stood, but Wolfe held up a hand. Not to stop him from following, but to speak. "Mr. Mayfield," he said, "you are not a criminal, but you are a coward." Rudy blinked. You took genius, kneaded it into mediocrity, and presented it as innovation. You buried a collaborator, rewrote a narrative, and when that falsehood bore consequences, you chose silence. "I didn't mean for—" "Intent," Wolfe said, "is the weakest defense of the weak. I suggest you spend your recovery reflecting not on your reputation, but on your recipe." Rudy left without another word. Clarissa lingered a moment longer. "Thank you, Mr. Wolfe." Wolfe didn't reply. He closed his eyes. The conversation, as far as he was concerned, had ended 3 paragraphs earlier. I escorted her out. She didn't look back. When I returned, Wolfe was in his chair, sipping beer, eyes half closed. "You know," I said, "all this over a cake." He didn't open his eyes. "It's never the cake, Archie. It's the vanity it's frosted with." I let that one bake and went to call Fritz. He'd want to know dinner was safe again,